Nice to see you all. Hope you had a pleasant Thanksgiving holiday with your families. Thank you. I do not have any comments at the top, so we can go straight to your questions. Kevin Frecking, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Josh. I wanted to ask, how does the administration view Fidel Castro's passing on the impact on the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Cuba? Does it delay? Does it hasten normalization of relations with Cuba?
Well, at least from the U.S. standpoint, I wouldn't expect any impact on the kind of progress that we're committed to making on our end to begin to normalize relations with Cuba. As you know, when President Obama made an announcement almost 2 years ago now to begin normalizing relations between our two countries, this was rooted in the president's conclusion that a policy of isolation that the United States had pursued for more than 5 decades had failed to bring about the improved human rights climate that I think just about every American citizen would like to see in Cuba. And after 5 decades of trying the same policy of isolation, without seeing many results, the president believed it was time to try something different. And what we have seen is greater freedom for American citizens to visit Cuba, to send money to family members in Cuba, to engage in business and seek business opportunities in Cuba. It also enhanced the ability of the United States government to maintain an embassy in Cuba, where U.S. officials can more effectively not just engage with government officials in Cuba, but also those activists in civil society that are fighting for greater freedoms. Those are all good things. Those are all benefits that are enjoyed by Americans. They also facilitate the kind of people-to-people ties that we believe will be more effective in bringing freedom and opportunity to the Cuban people, something that they have long sought and been denied by the Cuban government. And after 5 decades of not seeing any results, the president believed it was time to see something different. And I think it is. We clearly haven't seen all of the results that we would like to see, but we're pleased with the progress, and it certainly has benefited the American people in a tangible way, and it continues to be strongly supported by an overwhelming majority of Cubans when they're asked about their opinion of this change in our policy. It's something that was very warmly welcomed by the Cuban people, and I think that should be a pretty good indication of the kind of success that this policy is already having.
You said no on our end, but what about on their end? With his passing, do you anticipate that they would be more receptive to making some of the changes that the U.S. is calling for as far as opening up their private sector, things along those lines?
Yeah, time will tell. I'll let the Cuban government speak for the plans that they intend to pursue. Obviously, we would welcome a hastening of the kinds of changes that we would like to see, but I'll let my Cuban counterpart speak to any plans that they may have and whether or not they're changed by the death of Mr. Castro.
Just one more question along those lines. How does the president see, how will history view Fidel Castro in the president's mind?
Well, again, I think that he obviously is a towering figure who had a profound impact on the history of not just his country, but the Western Hemisphere. There certainly is no whitewashing the kinds of activities that he ordered and that his government presided over that go against the very values that this country, that our country, has long defended. I think the question for the president is, in terms of making policy, are we going to be rooted in that past, or are we going to look to the future? Doesn't mean that we should ignore the past, but it does mean that we can't let the past interfere with our ability to make progress. And I think some of the changes that we've seen on Cuba already are an indication that progress is possible. And that's been the focus of the president's policy direction over the last several years. And there certainly will be ample opportunity for historians to take stock of Fidel Castro's legacy and what it has meant for the people in his country.
One last one. Would you comment on President-elect Trump's claims of massive voter fraud taking place in the presidential election? Is there any truth whatsoever to what he's saying?
Well, Kevin, I think I would defer to the president-elect's team for commentary on his tweets. I think what I can say as an objective fact is that there's been no evidence produced to substantiate a claim like that. But for a reaction or an explanation, I'd refer you to the president-elect's team. Okay. Aisha.
Thank you. So a little more on Cuba. Can you tell us anything about what the thoughts are on an official delegation going to Castro's funeral, like where the plans are on that, if there's anything that you can announce?
If there is a U.S. delegation that's sent to attend the funeral, we'll obviously announce that publicly in the same way that we have other official delegations, but I don't have any information about that at this point to share.
So, going back to you mentioned how you can't whitewash some of Castro's actions. Some lawmakers did criticize the president's statement for not directly mentioning Castro's human rights abuses. Can you kind of talk about in the statement about his death? Can you kind of talk about or respond to that, and also like why was that decision made to not maybe more directly address some of those concerns?
Well, again, those critics of the statement are also critics of the policy and have been scrambling to try to justify their loyalty to an obviously failed policy of isolation that didn't bring about any results for the Cuban people or for the American people. I think the president's statement quite clearly speaks for itself. And it makes clear the president's desire to look toward the future. That's the responsibility that he has as the president of the United States and as the leader of this country, is to look out for the interests of the American people moving forward. It was the campaign slogan of his reelection. And that's what he's been focused on. And to issue some sort of blistering statement and engage in the kind of mutual recriminations that are tied to the past, it doesn't advance freedom or democracy on the island nation of Cuba. It doesn't expand economic opportunity or cultural opportunities for the American people. It doesn't advance further the success that we've had in removing the Cuba issue as an impediment in our relationship with countries throughout the Western Hemisphere. The president made the observation when he was in Latin America last week about the strength and health of the relationship between the United States and countries throughout the Western Hemisphere, and Latin America in particular. They're as strong as they've ever been. Some of that is because of the commitment that this administration has made to reach out to and engage countries in the Western Hemisphere to advance those relationships. But some of it is also attributable to the fact that for decades, the U.S. policy of isolating Cuba wasn't just an irritant in the relationship between the United States and Cuba. It actually was an irritant in the relationship between the United States and other countries in the Western Hemisphere that had a relationship with Cuba. And the consequence of that was that there wasn't as much of a discussion about the human rights conditions in Cuba There's an extensive discussion, though, about the wisdom of the U.S. policy of isolation toward Cuba. Now that that has been removed, there's been much more scrutiny of the way the Cuban government treats the Cuban people. And it has allowed the United States to marshal international opinion and shine a brighter light on those policies in a way that has increased pressure on the Cuban government. And I think this was on full, vivid display during the president's trip to Cuba earlier this spring, where the Cuban leader faced a direct probing question about the treatment of citizens in Cuba. So I think this is all part of a strategy that is strongly supported by the Cuban people, has already yielded important benefits for the Cuban people. It's also yielded important benefits for the American people. And I know that many of the president's critics like to suggest that somehow the United States has made a bunch of concessions to the Cuban government. That's wrong. It's not a concession to allow Cuban Americans to send more money to their family members who are living in Cuba. It's not a concession to secure the release of Alan Gross, a USAID contractor that was wrongly detained in Cuba. It's not a concession to open an embassy in Cuba. It's not a concession to start daily flights between the United States and Cuba that makes it easier for Americans to visit Cuba. It's not a concession to allow American cruise operators to stop in Cuba. It's not a concession to allow American hotel operators to sign licensing agreements with resorts in Cuba. It's not a concession to give American agricultural interests the opportunity to do more business in Cuba. All of those are things that have important benefits for the American people and are strongly supported by the Cuban people. So again, I think it is very difficult for critics of this policy to make any sort of coherent, evidence-based argument that somehow the United States has been disadvantaged by this policy. Based on all of the things that I've laid out, those are all benefits for the American people that we've all enjoyed. And continued pursuit of this policy moving forward only stands to enhance the benefits for the Cuban people and for the American people.
Thank you. But one more question on, there was an attack on Ohio State this morning. I was just wondering, has the president been briefed on that? Do you have anything further about the investigation of that attack?
The president was briefed this morning by Lisa Monaco, who is his top Homeland Security advisor. The president asked to be updated on the investigation. I know that local law enforcement officials have indicated that the situation in Columbus is no longer active. The site has been secured. FBI officials in Columbus are assisting local authorities as they conduct this investigation. But we'll obviously defer to local law enforcement to disclose additional information about what exactly occurred there. There's still a lot of information to review and collect. But obviously this is a difficult situation, and our thoughts and prayers with the people of Columbus and the community of Ohio State at this difficult time.
Thank you.